Have you ever wondered what it feels like to realize the system you've spent your entire career protecting was never protecting you? Most days, my job felt invisible. I wasn't chasing headlines or chasing promotions. I was chasing vulnerabilities. Quiet lines of code, layered encryption, silent protocols. My world was built on precision, discipline, and trust. I believed in the mission. I believed in the people I worked with. And more than anything, I believed loyalty was something earned and sacred. But loyalty, I would soon learn, can be twisted into something else entirely. It began with one data anomaly, a routine check, a familiar system, a tiny irregularity that shouldn't have mattered. But it did. Because when I followed that thread, I found something buried, something someone had gone to great lengths to hide. Classified information was being siphoned through a covert backdoor, rerouted to servers far outside U.S. jurisdiction. It wasn't a flaw. It was architecture. And someone on the inside had built it deliberately. My name is Elias Kwan. I was a lead systems architect at Orion Cyber, one of the top defense contractors in the country. This is how I exposed them, and what it cost. If what you're about to hear resonates with you, comment. Loyalty should never be a weapon. Before everything unraveled, I was exactly where I thought I was meant to be. At 29, I was the youngest systems architect at Orion Cyber, one of the fastest-growing cybersecurity contractors in the country. On paper, we were clean, sleek branding, polished presentations, government contracts with agencies like the Department of Energy, DHS, and the FAA. We handled everything from drone telemetry systems to emergency infrastructure backups. Behind the glossy exterior, the work was intense, meticulous, and under constant audit, or at least that's what I believed. I had come up through the hard path, undergraduate work at Caltech, graduate research in machine learning for adaptive intrusion detection. I wasn't flashy, and I didn't network well, but I wrote elegant, impenetrable code. Orion Cyber recruited me before I even defended my thesis. I remember my first day. The badge felt heavy, the building cold, the silence almost sacred. It felt like trust. My supervisor was Victor Cheng, charismatic, always composed, always 3 steps ahead. Mid-40s, British accent polished by elite prep schools and a resume full of acronyms no one dared question. He was the golden boy of the company, the one who'd landed the FAA contract, who always seemed to know which way the political wind was blowing. Victor didn't just run our team, he shaped it. His word was final on everything from design architecture to who got promoted. People liked him. I respected him. At least I thought I did. There were small things I didn't question back then. Victor never ran code reviews through team stand-ups. He preferred quiet approvals. A few undocumented tools slipped into production for client flexibility. If something wasn't aligned with standard procedure, it was waved off as proprietary need to know. We operated out of a fortified tech hub in Arlington, just blocks from federal oversight offices. Proximity meant credibility. The office looked like every other corporate bunker in the defense sector. Matte gray walls, fingerprint readers, motion-locked glass doors. Inside, teams sat in their silos. Compartmentalization was the rule. You only saw what your clearance allowed. That's how things like this survive. Victor once told me over coffee in the building's rooftop cafe that loyalty was the most valuable form of encryption. Everyone talks about firewalls, he said. But in this business, the real firewall is human trust. If that's strong, no line of code can be breached. I nodded. I didn't question what he meant. I do now. The truth is, I liked my job. I liked the structure, the discipline, the sense that I was part of something bigger than myself. I wasn't chasing money, though the pay was good. I wasn't chasing clout, though the security clearance felt like status. I was chasing purpose. I believed naively that the people I worked with believed the same thing. Looking back, I realized the company's transformation happened quietly. About a year before I made my discovery, Orion Cyber had been acquired by an overseas investment group, Jingai Capital, a holding entity registered in Luxembourg with funding trails that led to Singapore and indirectly, China. There were whispers, of course, subtle shifts in project priority, more emphasis on international client engagement, an internal restructuring that gave Victor unprecedented access to every segment of our codebase. But we didn't talk about it, because no one wanted to think about what that might mean. We had contracts to deliver, deadlines to meet. We were too focused on the work to see what was being built around us, and maybe that's how they planned it. By the time I realized what was really going on, Victor had already rewritten the rules, code, ethics, trust, all hidden in plain sight. And I was the last person he expected to notice. It started on a Thursday afternoon, quiet, overcast, unremarkable. I was working through a batch of internal QA logs from the FAA's drone coordination program, running comparative checks between live telemetry streams and archived simulations. Most anomalies were trivial: timing mismatches, protocol lags, handshake retries, noise. But line 4129 in one of the packet logs caught my eye. The packet's origin ID looked legitimate, registered from an FAA substation in Nevada, but its destination flag was wrong. Very wrong. It wasn't routed to our internal simulation buffer or the FAA's testing sandbox. It was tagged for a private node, one I didn't recognize. I ran a reverse trace. The IP led to a server cluster registered to a cloud provider based in Singapore, encrypted, obscured through at least 3 proxies. That alone wasn't a smoking gun. International redundancy backups weren't unheard of, though they were rare. But this packet wasn't a backup. It was live, and it wasn't alone. I pulled deeper and found a pattern. Once every 18 hours, under a very specific set of conditions, when telemetry signals aligned with internal diagnostic pings, a dormant script embedded in the system would activate. It wasn't malware. It was clean, lean, elegant. Code that didn't trip any alarms because it looked like it belonged. And that was the problem. It bypassed both local logging and our hardened auditing shell. It packaged small data segments, compressed flight logs, environmental telemetry, geolocation trails, and sent them out through a disguised maintenance port. Every single time the data went to the same offshore node. It took me 2 hours to isolate the trigger mechanism, 4 to confirm the behavior through sandbox replication. By the time I was certain of what I'd found, my hands were cold. Not from fear, from precision. This wasn't a glitch. This was intentional, sophisticated, and embedded at a level no third-party vendor should have been able to access. I checked the deployment logs. The subroutine had been introduced during the last firmware update, 3 weeks ago. I pulled up the approval metadata. There it was, approved by V. Cheng Victor. At first I wanted to believe it was a mistake, maybe a test stub left in by accident, maybe an internal diagnostics function mislabeled, but the more I looked, the less innocent it seemed. The code had its own fingerprint, AES 256 encryption, obfuscation layers labeled in Mandarin, even internal variable names referencing JSEC, shorthand in certain cyber circles, for Jinghai Secure. I checked the code repository logs again. The commit came from Victor's terminal, digitally signed, no proxy. He had built it, approved it, deployed it. That night, I didn't leave the office. I closed the blinds, turned off all Wi-Fi and Bluetooth functions on my system, and opened a secure terminal with no outbound access. I began replicating the findings, documenting each packet trail, each data segment, each timestamp. For years, I had believed in this job because it demanded discipline, precision, order. That's why this breach hit so hard. This wasn't sloppiness. It was elegance with intent. I reviewed the other recent firmware updates. 3 other systems showed similar subroutines, modified in just the last 2 months. One for the Department of Energy, one for the National Water Grid Simulation Network, one for the CDC's Emergency Response Framework. All were subtle. All activated only under edge case conditions. All sent data abroad, and every single one bore Victor's approval. At 2:17 a.m., I printed the core logs and sealed them in a personal secure envelope. Then I walked to the executive floor and stood outside Victor's office, hand clenched around the evidence. I hesitated, He wasn't just my supervisor. He was the man who'd recruited me, who had written my name into projects I wasn't even cleared for yet. He had vouched for me, shaped my career, praised my ethics in public. But now I couldn't shake the sickening thought. Maybe that had always been the plan. Maybe I'd been the camouflage. That night, as I rode the elevator back down to the cold, quiet parking structure, I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just a breach. It was a betrayal. I didn't sleep that night. By the time the office lights flickered back on at 7 a.m., I was already at my desk, staring at the compiled documentation, packet logs, timestamps, firmware commit hashes, and Victor's digital signature at the bottom of every single one. I waited until 9:12 a.m. when his calendar showed a break between meetings. Then I walked straight to his office, evidence in hand. Victor looked up from his screen, that familiar, effortless calm on his face. "Elias, you're early. Something urgent." I shut the door behind me. "I found something in the FAA firmware logs," I said, placing the printouts on his desk. "Data redirection, triggered packets, all routed to an offshore node registered through proxies. These scripts weren't in our last audit." Victor glanced at the first page, then leaned back in his chair with a measured breath. "That's diagnostic telemetry," he said. "Part of a redundancy test we've been running with third-party backup infrastructure. You know how critical flight systems are. We need fallback servers outside CONUS in case of systemic interruption." I didn't blink. "That's not documented in any internal protocol. The server isn't listed on the white node chart, and the commits came from your terminal." His jaw tightened. "Barely. You've always been detail-oriented, Elias, but you're reading this with a narrow lens. Strategic redundancy requires agility, especially when working across agencies. Not everything can go through standard review." "This wasn't reviewed at all," I replied. "And it wasn't just the FAA system. I found similar behavior in DOE and CDC systems. None of them were authorized. And the variable structure, Chinese language tags, Victor, that's not just agile, that's buried intent." He laughed. Not a loud laugh, low, almost sympathetic. "You've been at this long enough to know how the game works," he said. "You think our competitors don't do the same? You think government contracts are clean? They're not. Clients expect flexibility. What you're seeing is strategic access." "To foreign servers?" I said, my voice colder than I'd expected. "That's not strategic access, that's data exfiltration." Victor's face changed then. Just a flicker, but enough. The laugh vanished. The charm faded. "I brought you into this company because I thought you understood the world as it is, not as you want it to be," he said, voice now low and firm. "You're a smart man, Elias, but idealism doesn't win contracts. It doesn't keep your clearance, and it definitely doesn't keep this company running." I stared at him. 6 years of trust gone in 6 minutes. "I can't ignore this," I said. He nodded slowly. "Then, maybe this isn't the place for you anymore." I walked out without saying another word. Back at my desk, the world felt different. My monitors, once filled with code and architecture, now felt like evidence. The people around me, team leads, data analysts, DevSecOps specialists, they went about their work unaware that the man signing their deployment checks was selling out the systems they thought they were protecting. I opened my terminal, shut down all live links, and activated an encrypted container drive I kept for off-grid testing. I wasn't just collecting evidence now. I was preparing to leave the system, to expose it, to fight it from the outside. The next few days passed in a strange blur, like watching your life from the other side of soundproof glass. I showed up on time. I coded when I had to. I responded to emails. But inside, I was dismantling everything. Quietly, methodically. And the more I looked, the more I realized this wasn't isolated. I started with a pattern recognition sweep on systems Victor had touched in the last 6 months. Using internal sandbox mirrors, I built parallel traces of commit histories. In the Department of Energy framework, I found a conditional loop that activated only during nighttime off-peak energy draws, perfect for slipping out megabytes of grid data undetected. In the CDC's emergency health platform, a falsified certificate allowed a mirrored login session, ghosting administrative actions without trace. No alarms, no log flags, no red text, only silence. The kind of silence you only get when someone high up wants it quiet. What disturbed me more wasn't the breach itself, but how well it had been woven into the culture of the company. Victor had shaped everything: policies, review procedures, even our internal risk thresholds. He'd cultivated a workplace that rewarded obedience cloaked as efficiency. He kept things moving, lean and fast, because speed prevents scrutiny, and it wasn't just him. One morning, I received an automated system audit notice, routine. But when I checked the access logs, I saw something that didn't add up. Someone had remotely accessed my terminal overnight using elevated admin credentials tied to corporate compliance. Someone had been watching me. Not just the code, me. Later that day, my badge access to the Level 4 diagnostic server failed, without explanation. I submitted an IT ticket. No response. When I asked Victor directly, he said, "We're tightening access control during the audit cycle." His tone was casual, but his eyes watched me too closely. They knew I was looking. They just weren't sure how much I'd found. That night, I went home and disconnected everything. No Wi-Fi, no router. I worked off a clean air-gapped laptop, no firmware history, no attached network interfaces. I powered up my personal crypto vault and dumped all system traces into a secure container. I cross-referenced Victor's code commits with company-wide integration schedules. His fingerprints weren't just on core systems, they were in the infrastructure. He had buried himself into the plumbing, access tunnels, recovery protocols, even fake exception reports that passed through untouched. It wasn't just sabotage, it was architecture. And worst of all, no one else seemed to see it. Not the engineers buried in test cases. Not the project managers chasing federal milestones. Everyone was heads down, laser-focused on metrics and delivery dates. No one was asking who was really steering the ship. That night I remembered something Victor had once said, half-jokingly, during a team meeting. Real security is when no one even knows the system's been compromised. Now I understood what he meant. He wasn't securing anything, he was hiding. In plain sight. I don't know the exact moment I decided to become a whistleblower. There wasn't a dramatic trigger, no slammed door, no shouted confrontation. Just a slow rising certainty. A line once invisible had become undeniable. And I couldn't unsee it. I thought of my grandfather, a man I'd barely known but whose story had shaped my life. He fled mainland China in the early 1950s during the rise of the People's Republic. Escaped to Taiwan with nothing but a military uniform and a belief that freedom once lost was almost never reclaimed. He lived modestly, taught math in a public school, and refused to speak about politics. But every time I visited him, he'd ask me the same quiet question. "Are you still telling the truth with your work?" I used to smile and nod. Now I wasn't so sure. That night I sat in my apartment surrounded by physical files, printouts, encrypted drives, and my own reflection on a dark screen. I'd been taught that cyber defense was about building walls, but this wasn't about walls anymore. It was about rot. And the rot wasn't external. It was coming from the people inside the castle. I knew what I had to do. Her name was Sarah Givens, a senior threat analyst I'd met during a DHS Red Team exercise the year before. She was smart, blunt, and impossible to intimidate. We'd worked together for 6 weeks to test the FAA's emergency blackout response, and I'd trusted her instincts from day one. I contacted her using a secure burner channel she'd taught me to use during a simulated data breach. DHS called it Gray Tunnel Protocol, an anonymized digital Dropbox designed for sensitive packet delivery, with built-in redundancy and no central point of access. I double-checked every layer of encryption, verified file hashes, and signed, The submission with a one-time use identity token tied to my old sandbox username. Then I uploaded everything. Packet logs, code signatures, deployment timestamps, Victor's commit records, the rerouted IPs and encryption keys. My own internal memos and access reports. It took 9 minutes. The server issued a confirmation receipt with a 4-word message. Payload verified, submission accepted. I stared at the screen for a long time after that. The silence in my apartment felt different now. Heavy. Final. This was the point of no return. I had just exposed a multi-agency contractor operating under foreign influence. If I was right, the systems meant to protect national infrastructure had been compromised, deliberately, methodically, and the man responsible had built his entire reputation on his supposed integrity. If I was wrong, I'd just handed over internal trade secrets, violated 3 NDAs, and torched my entire career. But if I stayed silent, the backdoors would stay active, the data would keep flowing. And one day I'd wake up to the news that a drone had crashed, or a grid had gone dark, or a CDC system had been hacked, and I'd know exactly where it started. No, silence wasn't an option. By 3 a.m., I was back in my office building. I didn't log into the main network. I used a standalone diagnostic machine to create cold backups of everything I hadn't sent yet. I placed them in a sealed anti-static drive and locked them inside my personal secure cabinet. Not for leverage. For insurance. When I finally left the building, the streets were empty. A soft rain had started falling, soaking the pavement, blurring the city lights. I stood at the curb for a moment, watching the drops hit the concrete. I wasn't afraid. Not yet. But I knew what was coming. The next morning, my badge access failed. The front desk clerk smiled awkwardly and said, "It's running a new credential. Refresh." I nodded, played along, and sat at an empty hot desk near the break room. My workstation login still worked. But I could feel the system watching me. The machine was slower. Login processes took longer. Background tasks were active that I hadn't launched. They knew. Not everything. Not yet. But enough to tighten the perimeter, and it confirmed what I'd feared all along. This wasn't just about Victor. I was now a threat to something much larger. The walls didn't close in all at once. They moved inch by inch, quiet, subtle, surgical. By the end of that week, I had been removed from 2 project channels without explanation. My name was no longer listed on the deployment schedule. When I asked about the changes, Victor replied, with a clipped, rehearsed line, "Realignment of responsibilities during audit review." The performance review came next. 6 years of spotless records, suddenly overwritten by fabricated documentation. A PDF appeared in the HR system titled, "Employee Evaluation, Elias Kwan," marked confidential. It included vague accusations, inconsistent performance, lack of communication, unauthorized code access. All lies, all time-stamped and digitally signed by Victor. It was more than retaliation. It was a legal setup. I was being framed for sabotage. A week later, I was called into a meeting with Orion Cyber's general counsel and a woman I'd never seen before, a private investigator contracted to support internal risk mitigation. They laid out the threat clearly. If I continued violating data access protocols, they'd pursue federal charges. "This is a serious matter," she said. "You're jeopardizing national contracts and classified infrastructure. We expect full cooperation." I sat still, silent, watching, listening. Victor had turned the company's full weight against me. But what they didn't know was that Sarah Givens had already responded. 2 days earlier, I had received a short encrypted message on my burner channel. "We've received your documentation. DHS and FBI have initiated preliminary counterintelligence protocols. Stay low, don't engage." I knew what that meant. I wasn't alone anymore, but I wasn't safe either. That same evening, a former engineer from Orion Cyber messaged me through a private signal relay. Her name was Ana Morales, and she had been pushed out of the company 2 years earlier, after raising similar concerns. I saw the same thing, she wrote. Victor buried it under client-requested diagnostic access. I filed an internal report. My access was revoked 2 days later. No one ever followed up. She had screenshots, contract drafts, internal emails from a Jinghai-linked executive discussing quiet flexibility clauses in federal frameworks. One of the files referenced a system I'd never even worked on, one tied to military satellite coordination. The implications were massive. This wasn't just about critical infrastructure anymore. This was about defense systems, satellites, real-time intel. I now understood the scale. Victor wasn't freelancing. He was executing a plan, one protected at the highest levels of this shadow operation. As I left the office that day, I passed by Victor's door. It was ajar. He was on a call speaking Mandarin fluently, smooth, direct, like someone who'd used the language for decades. He didn't look surprised to see me. He didn't stop talking. He just turned, made eye contact, and smiled. That's when I knew he was daring me to act. I didn't sleep that night, not because of fear, but because of clarity. Everything was now in motion, too fast, too deep to stop. At 3:11 a.m., I sat in my apartment with the last encrypted packet queued for upload. It contained the most damning evidence yet, the internal communications Anna had sent me, the ghost access logs from the satellite coordination network, and most importantly, screenshots of Victor's back-channel correspondence with a known Jinghai executive using burner relay protocols. The metadata alone was a map of silent sabotage. I didn't use the same whistleblower drop as before. This time I transmitted the file directly to 2 secure endpoints, Sarah at DHS and a field agent from the FBI cyber unit, whose key Sarah had verified for me. The second message wasn't just a backup, it was an escalation. Inside the package, I included a personal memo. This operation extends beyond Orion Cyber. My supervisor attempted to coerce me into retracting previous claims. Attached are screenshots of fabricated performance reports, threat statements from legal counsel, and evidence of administrative surveillance. The company is not acting alone. I clicked send at 3:19 a.m. It was done. That morning I received no official notice, no suspension, no revocation, just silence. And that silence was louder than any disciplinary action. It meant they were scrambling, but at 10:42 a.m. the signal changed. An alert from my off-grid monitoring script pinged. Someone had accessed the Singapore node from a different IP range. Not a corporate IP, a military one, U.S. origin. Someone inside the government was now watching the same packet path I had exposed. That was the twist I hadn't expected. Sarah texted me minutes later. You're not the only one they tried to silence. We've just confirmed mirrored code fragments in 3 other contractor platforms. Get ready. Then she sent a single line that made everything crystal clear. It's bigger than Victor, much bigger. I sat back in my chair, pulse steady, breath slow. The war I'd stepped into wasn't just about corrupted contracts or compromised servers. This was intelligence warfare, disguised as compliance, and I had just become the most inconvenient truth in a very dangerous story. Part 9. The Fall of the Firewall. 500 words. The following morning, the city looked the same. Clean streets, silent glass towers, but something in the air had shifted. I arrived at a predetermined meeting point. A private briefing room inside a nondescript federal building tucked behind a courthouse in Washington. No signage, no security desk, just a man in a navy jacket who checked my ID and waved me in. Inside sat Sarah Givens. Beside her, a second figure, calm, precise, and clearly not from DHS. He introduced himself simply, Agent Matthew Lin, FBI Cyber Division. We've reviewed everything, Sarah said without preamble. The files you submitted didn't just confirm our suspicions. They filled in the exact blind spots that had stalled our investigation for months. Agent Lin took over, pulling out a secure tablet and laying it flat. On screen, a live network. Map flickered. Nodes, protocols, redirection pathways. The servers you tracked match packet traces from 3 unrelated federal breaches. We thought they were isolated incursions. Your logs proved they were connected." He zoomed into a log stream, showing date-stamped data extractions from the Department of Energy, the FAA, and a private contractor tied to satellite imaging. "All of them share code markers built by Orion Cyber," he continued. "More specifically, signed off by Victor Cheng." Then came the hammer. "This morning at 4:32 a.m., we executed federal warrants. Servers were seized at Orion Cyber's Arlington facility. Data caches secured. 3 executives are now in federal custody, including Victor Cheng." The words barely landed. For a moment I felt nothing. No vindication, no celebration, just quiet. Sarah handed me a folder. Inside were transcripts of internal communications they had uncovered during the raid. Victor had been in contact, not just with Jinghai Capital, but with 2 other intermediaries, both flagged by U.S. intelligence as having ties to foreign data laundering operations. "This wasn't about one man," she said. "Victor was a mechanism, a trusted inside channel used to quietly exfiltrate sensitive infrastructure intelligence. Over 18 months, he helped reroute more than 47 gigabytes of classified behavioral and system telemetry." Agent Lin leaned forward. "But thanks to you, the chain is broken, at least on this front." I looked at the screen again. One of the IPs on the live map was now blacked out, shut down, severed. "What happens next?" I asked. Agent Lin replied, without hesitation. "Now we go after the second layer, the investors, the silent partners, the ones who think they're untouchable." I thought of the smiles, the press releases, the industry awards Orion Cyber had won over the years. I thought of Victor's voice, calm and reasonable as he justified betrayal, and then I thought of every engineer still writing code in that building, trusting that their work was protecting the country. They had no idea how close they'd come to serving something else entirely. Now, at least, they'd have a chance to do it right, because the firewall hadn't just fallen, it had exposed everything behind it. 2 weeks later, I received the official offer, a classified systems architect, role under the Department of Homeland Security, working within a joint task force focused on critical infrastructure defense. The clearance level was higher than anything I'd ever held. The scope was broader than any commercial project I'd worked on. And the purpose, finally, felt unshakable. It wasn't just a job. It was a clean slate. The onboarding process was intense. Polygraphs, background re-verification, psychological assessments. Every step was a reminder. This time, the walls were real. The mission was real. And the people around me weren't just chasing contract bonuses. They were building the last line of defense. I started working on a grid-hardening protocol for the national power infrastructure. Ironically, one of the very systems Victor had tried to quietly undermine. The work was deep-layer, low-level code auditing, integrating AI-assisted anomaly detection with human behavioral oversight. Tedious to some, but not to me. For the first time in years, I wasn't looking over my shoulder. I wasn't trying to stay invisible. I was exactly where I was supposed to be. One afternoon, after finishing a review session, I received a message from Sarah. No subject line. Just one sentence. "You rewrote the narrative." I sat with those words for a long moment. Because she was right. I hadn't just exposed a breach or survived retaliation. I'd rewritten the function of who I was, inside the system. No longer a quiet piece of the machine, but something else. A line of code that refused to obey the wrong command. A firewall, rebuilt with purpose. And for the first time since this all began, I looked in the mirror and saw someone I actually recognized. Not a pawn, not a tool, just a man who told the truth and let it change everything. Some breaches are digital, others are human. What happened at Orion Cyber wasn't just a flaw in the system. It was a flaw in the assumptions we build around power, trust, and silence. Victor didn't act alone. He thrived inside a structure designed to reward obedience. and punish questions. And for a long time, I was part of that silence, not because I agreed, but because I didn't want to be the problem. But the truth is this: silence is complicity, especially when you know better. What saved me wasn't just evidence, it was the decision to act, early, quietly, and with full knowledge of the consequences. That decision cost me a career, a reputation, and a sense of safety, but it gave me something greater: clarity. And now when I write a line of code or walk into a secure server room, I know exactly what I'm protecting and why it matters. So if this story made something click for you, comment. Integrity is louder than silence, because someone else out there is probably feeling what I felt: unsure, isolated, afraid to speak up. And your voice, even in a comment, might remind them that doing the right thing isn't foolish. It's necessary. If this story stayed with you, share it. Someone needs to hear it today.